We will halve inflation, grow the economy, reduce debt.
Nothing's changed. The circus moves on, rinse and repeat.
We have an opportunity to become Europe's Silicon Valley.
We can perhaps be a broker of some sort with Ukraine.
We expect inflation to come off quite rapidly in the rest of this year. Obviously, we want to see that happen.
What we now need is a period of stable, quiet, serious government.
You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Lizzy Burden. Coming up on today's programme, we're going to hear from the Chancellor's economic advisor, Valero, who's also a distinguished policy fellow at the London School of Economics Centre for Economic Performance.
Now, Lizzy, talking of the Chancellor, last year Jeremy Hunt flagged that green technology was one of the sectors that has the most potential for growth. But the Left of Centre Research Group says today that without a national investment fund to help turn startups into tomorrow's big companies, the UK risks falling behind the US.
Well, the IPPR says that the UK needs billions of pounds of strategic state investment to put green manufacturing at the heart of the economy. So far, the UK, some would say, has barely responded to the US Inflation Reduction Act, President Biden's massive net zero spending programme that, of course, was launched a year ago.
Yeah, massive really is the right word to use. More than $370 billion in subsidies, including tax credits for electric vehicles and incentives for clean energy projects. And to make matters worse for the UK, the EU has made it clear that it's not going to sit idly by while the US steals a march on all this green tech.
Yeah, the UK is somewhere between the US's carrot and the EU's stick. But what is it going to do? I think this IPPR suggestion sounds somewhat suspiciously similar to what Labour would like to do.
Yeah, it's funny that. I think it's a problem for the government, isn't it? Because the UK is a big economy, but compared to the US or the bloc that is the EU, we're small fry. And finding these kind of massive piles of cash when the government finances are very stretched is very difficult. And ideologically, I think a lot of Tories are quite opposed to throwing cash at companies as well. Some see it as corporate welfare. So I just think this is a big problem for us at competing in this green subsidy world.
But look, productivity has been a long-run problem for the UK. It's become a political one. And getting companies to invest in an environment like this, with potentially a recession on the horizon, is very difficult. And Bloomberg reports today that Britain's small businesses have seen sales drop by 20% over the past year. This is according to accounting data from Sage. It's been shared exclusively with Bloomberg. And Sage says that SMEs are struggling with a triple challenge of falling profits, falling revenues and falling sales. I spoke to the Chancellor's economic advisor and a distinguished policy fellow at the London School of Economics Centre for Economic Performance, Valero, and I started by asking her whether she's worried about the outlook for the UK economy. Take a listen.
Any economist observing the UK economy at the moment is worried about our poor growth outlook. If you look at the recent data, there is some good news on inflation. There's also some bad news. So, of course, there's going to be this balancing act about how we can tame inflation while avoiding pushing ourselves into an unnecessary recession. Clearly, as you said, small businesses, they make up the vast majority of firms in the UK. I think it's over 99%, but also a large share of employment and revenue. So around 60% of people are employed in small firms. And the reality is that they've been through a series of shocks against also some quite difficult foundations. So if we take the foundations first, since the financial crisis, many smaller firms face financing constraints, etc. There's this well-established long tail of less productive smaller firms that have challenges adopting productivity-enhancing management practices and digital technologies. What we've then seen, of course, is a series of shocks and challenges for such firms, which kind of culminates in this current situation we're in now. So change due to Brexit, obviously the pandemic, the energy shock. So this has really been hard for smaller firms. They often find it harder to adjust. It's harder to access external finance. It's harder to maybe have the skills in place that they need. This is concerning for the UK economy. And of course, within smaller firms, there are different types of smaller firms. We tend to talk about the high growth economy as perhaps around 40,000 firms, depending on how you define it, that have high growth potential. They really want to grow, and often they might face heightened constraints in accessing that scale-up finance during recession or during hard times. So there's kind of that side of it, the future large companies that can be a great source of dynamism and productivity growth in the UK, and kind of the broader group of SMEs that we really need them to be investing in digital technologies and the types of things that will make them more productive too.
You mentioned that mixed economic data. Yesterday we saw the UK public finances data coming in, actually borrowing below official estimates. The Chancellor, of course, has got his autumn statement coming up around the corner. He's said that he's going to cut taxes when it's affordable and that he's going to make full expensing permanent when it's affordable. What should he prioritise?
I think it's this permanence of the full expensing, because what we really need now, rather than short-term politically motivated tax cuts, is targeted support for the things that we know we need to improve that supply potential of the UK economy and hence our productivity. Because really it's business investment that is the fundamental key to getting growth going again. We know that that has been particularly poor in the UK for some time. And there are a number of things we can do. Tax on its own or tax improved allowances for investment won't solve the problem, but it's definitely a key part of it. There are other things. We've seen the pensions reforms, and that's a great step in the right direction. Planning is a key thing for removing barriers to investment. And as I mentioned, the suite of issues around smaller firms and what's the appropriate support to be providing them.
You mentioned pensions in terms of growing the economy, but of course one of the other policies of the government is the triple lock, and it's increasingly looking difficult to afford it when it's got to go up by either 2.5% inflation or wage growth. Wage growth's hot. Would you advise the Chancellor to look again at affordability of the triple lock?
Well, I mean, there's a big debate around this. And, obviously it's really important for us to be protecting the vulnerable in society. And that's something that this was designed to do. There are now issues, as highlighted by the OBR, in terms of the baby boomers, kind of the demographic trends of that generation. And then, of course, this high inflation environment making it more costly. So there are reasons from the perspective of sustainability of our finances for looking at that. Of course, there's massive debates around intergenerational fairness too, and how actually younger people, working families are often in poverty and perhaps not getting the same support. So, I think looking at this seems like the right thing to do, but whether a wholesale change to this at this point would be desirable or feasible is another matter.
And of course, one of the Prime Minister's top priorities is to cut the national debt. We have seen this downgrade of US debt by Fitch recently. Are you concerned that the UK could potentially see the same, given how much of its debt's index linked?
I mean, of course, that's always a concern, which is why it's so important for us to manage our public finances prudently. So I think, we've got strong institutions in the UK. We've certainly reversed a lot of the damage that we saw last year during quite a volatile time. I think that's why it's important now to be focusing on being really careful if there is any headroom, spending on something that can actually credibly be seen as expanding that productive capacity of the economy, getting the denominator, so the GDP part of the debt to GDP ratio, we just need to get that growing. That's a really, really important part of the prospects and the outlook of the UK economy, which forms the basis of these types of ratings.
So that was one of the Chancellor's economic advisors, Anna Valero, speaking to me earlier. And joining us now for analysis is Bloomberg senior economics reporter Phil Aldrick, the author of that Small Businesses Scoop. Phil, Dr. Valero is just one member of this Economic Advisory Council to the Chancellor. You speak to all of them all the time, and you recently wrote that a majority of them are concerned about the risk of the Bank of England over-tightening. How does she compare to the others that you speak to?
Yeah, I mean, there is this general. I don't know, if we can go into the individual's particular preferences, but there is this general concern now that policy lags mean that all of the tightening that's been done already may only start to show up belatedly. And actually, the recent data today, we've had the PMI data, which obviously shows the first negative PMI reading in 7 months, and the indication that GDP may actually be falling in the current quarter, and the small business data set, which tallies with other sort of surveys that the Federation of Small Businesses and others do, suggest that the small business sector, which is very, very important to the economy, is really feeling the squeeze. So if you want to make the argument that it's time to pause, it's becoming an easier argument to make, and I think certainly there seems to be indication that the members of the advisory committee to the Chancellor are growing. They're putting more weight on the fact that there's a possibility to pause. Obviously, it's not their decision. Obviously, it's not for the Chancellor's decision. It is the Bank of England's decision. But I'm presuming they were just sharing their opinions. Yeah, I was struck by a line in your piece, actually. The Bank of England said yesterday that half of businesses are experiencing debt servicing stress at the most since the financial crisis. Half of businesses, that's really quite a stark figure, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, so if you look at the chart, it's always relatively high. So it's creeping up. So that's not it's not like they normally. There's no businesses experiencing distress. There's normally something like a third or so in distress. But the point is that it is rising, and you can see this very clear impact of interest rates. So in the small business survey, the small business data set that we saw was it also pointed to the fact that actually, and this is in the Bank of England numbers as well, the small businesses are struggling to access credit. The Federation of Small Businesses is saying that is one of the major problems for small firms. At the same time, they have cash balances because they did build up some cash due to the bounce back loans and other mechanisms during the last couple of years, but those cash balances have been coming down, and you've seen the biggest sort of contraction in cash balances in quite a while. So if they don't have access to credit and they're running out of cash, or they're running their cash down, that's not a good place to be, because basically that's how cash is king, as we all know. So that they could be in for a tough time. Yeah, and also this SAGE's tracker, which you wrote up for the Bloomberg terminal, show that small companies are paying off debt at the fastest pace in at least 5 years. In a way, that sounds like good news, doesn't it? But it probably isn't from a growth perspective, is it? Yeah. So if the preferences, I mean, obviously this is another indication of what's happening with interest rates, because you've got a big stock of debt, interest rates have gone up, suddenly you've got a whole load of extra costs there because you've got to service it, and so they want to reduce their debt to try and reduce their outgoings, it's effectively reducing their fixed costs. So there is a good reason to do it, but that means that they are not investing, and that's the point to sort of the growth story. If they want to deal with their debts rather than take on credit to grow, then that is going to have a read across to the economic prospects for the country. Which is rather like us seeing people paying off their mortgages and not spending it in the shops and the restaurants, holding back growth. I mean, you've got these bad PMI numbers, surprising on the downside. You've had the data from SAGE on small businesses. Does it look like we're on for a recession now, especially when it looks like more Bank of England hikes are actually coming? The UK economy has proved to be a lot more resilient than anyone thought. Like you remember the pre-pandemic days when interest rates were at 0.75%, and that was supposed to be exciting because we'd had a quarter point interest rate rise, and that was just shocking. And the concept of just doing even doubling rates to 1.5 then would be touching R*, and all these economic theories of what the economy could handle. We're at 5.25%, and only now starting to feel the implications of that. It seems. I would be very hesitant to say that we're heading for a recession, because there is just a lot more resilience in the economy than anyone thought. I mean, if you just look at what's been happening. So actually, by the time of the election, things could look pretty good. So we're talking about a year from now, 14 months from now is the anticipated, is the expected sort of time for an election. I mean, I don't know, pretty good is probably overstating it, Lizzy. But, always the optimist, Bill. I mean, the bank has said that they expect rates to remain high and they're not going to cut rates. I think this is an indication that they would rather keep rates at this high level than just having to keep ramping them up, right? So you're not going to see much rate easing, so households are going to feel the squeeze, continue to feel the squeeze, and businesses will continue to feel the squeeze. But if rates can stop at this level, we can maybe we can just sort of scratch economic living, get creep above recessionary levels, and also wages are going to be rising in real terms, and probably in the next set of wage and inflation data, you're going to see distinct, clearly that wages are real wages. People are actually earning more than
rising
prices are taking away. So living standards will technically be improving. So if you can get, and that'll should continue for the rest of the next year. So you would be able to say something positive about living standards when you go into an election.
Talking of the election, I wanted to ask you about those public finance figures we got this week. Fiscal drag, which means that tax allowances are going up slower than inflation, therefore netting cash for the government, has really been working quite nicely, hasn't it? And the government's finances are looking much less bad than we thought they would be. It does look like the government could be left with quite a juicy pile of cash in 2024, which, election year.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Would that be too cynical?
No, I mean, yes, I suppose they probably have been aware that, it's certainly the case that rising wages where the thresholds are frozen are extraordinarily cash rich for the tax rich for the government. So they do get these extra revenues. But this time that they are contending with inflation is eating into the debt costs because of the RPI index links gilts, and also high rates are really hammering their debt servicing costs as well. So they get with one hand and they have to give back with the other much more than they did. So, but there probably will be a little bit of extra headroom, I would imagine, than in the short term than was forecast in March at the March budget, when the autumn statement, which was probably in November sometime. But I can't imagine it's going to be a huge gift which is going to give them masses of spending opportunities, but it certainly the Chancellor likes to sell the argument a bit at the moment that we've got no money left, when possibly, or he literally did have no money left. There's 6 billion left at the March budget, when he might have a little bit more than that, but it's still pretty minimal.
So with that little bit of headroom, you heard there, I was asking Anna Valero whether he should spend it on tax cuts. We also talked about the affordability of the triple lock. Do you think that either party would actually question the triple lock, especially when they need the votes of the pensioners?
Yeah, it's I think Labour are on side for the triple lock at the moment, but it is going to be expensive, because I think the next earnings data will determine what the triple lock will be set at, and it looks like it'll probably rise by 7+%, 7.5%, which is a big expensive. When pensions are over £100 billion. I mean, it's
nice if you're a boomer.
Yeah, it's going to be very expensive for taxpayers in general. So it does make sense to look at this, and as the IFS and others have pointed out, and as Anna was saying there, that there is intergenerational issues. That poverty is actually, obviously, the original plan was to try and fix pensioner poverty. It has been improved dramatically, and there are now sections of society where where there is poverty, in-work poverty, which probably need to be looked at equally, and I think that those sectors don't have the salience, the political salience that the pensioner vote has.
Phil, plenty of economic news to keep us busy in August. Nice to chew it over with you. That's our senior economics reporter, Phil Aldrick.
Now, many small and medium-sized companies will be keen to find new markets for their products, especially after Brexit. Uzbekistan probably isn't the first country on the list, but it's exactly where the UK's Export Minister Malcolm Offord has been. It's not a summer holiday, but it's a trip to try to increase sales to this Central Asian country.
I wouldn't mind a visit there. The government says it's willing to finance up to £3 billion in credit to support exports to Uzbekistan. Well, Stephen Carroll called Lord Offord while he was on his trip to ask him why the focus there instead of in the US or, say, India.
Central Asia, Uzbekistan is one of the fastest growing regions in the world, but it's got a young population. 55% of the population here under 30. The economic growth is averaging 6 to 7% per year. There's real opportunities for UK businesses as this country opens up, is now developing its education system, developing its infrastructure, developing its industries, and we in the UK have got a lot to offer and want to help this country grow, and therefore that's why we're here.
Can you give us some examples of the sort of areas you feel that the UK could be able to sell products to Uzbekistan?
Well, yes. I mean, there's a number. There's education, there's digital, there's mining, there's infrastructure. If you take mining and infrastructure, I mean, for example, looking at the building a new airport here, and also upgrading the existing airport. They've got terrific mining opportunities with ferrous metals that we have great expertise in within the UK. Their education system is increasingly using English as its first language. And with this young population, who are all well educated and all very digital, who are looking to industries of the future, we in the UK have got a real opportunity to go with them on this journey and help them modernise and help them access those industries of the future.
Uzbekistan at the moment is a pretty small trade partner for the UK. On Bloomberg's trade data rankings, it's ranked as 76th. Total trade about £270 million a year, according to your figures. What's the potential for this relationship?
Well, you're right. That's very small. It's about $250 million, which is, a bit, as you say, it's in the ranking 70 or so in our rankings. But the only way is up, really, isn't it? Because we've got an opportunity to increase our trade with them. And for example, as part of the initiative here, I'm leading the team from UK Export Finance, which is our export credit agency, which is basically the financial system, the wrapper system. We can help them build their airports, their roads, their railways, and make sure we get 20 or 30% of those contracts coming to British SMEs. And the Treasury have allocated a $3 billion credit line to ECA. So that gives you some idea of the potential.
What would you see that relationship evolving to, though? If we're talking about it being £267 million a year at the moment, is this, in your eyes, the potential for a billions of pounds trade relationship?
Well, I think we should certainly have a target to get to billion in relatively short order, especially now that we got the $3 billion allocated against ECA. And what I will say to you is when we look at the projects, whether it's building airports, whether it's building roads, building schools, etc., the opportunity really is back in the UK, is for our SMEs who have got all the expertise in the supply chains to get access to these deals and provide the expertise and the products to those contracts. And increasingly, remember, that's services, not just manufactured goods.
So a lot of people will be wondering why you're there focusing on Uzbekistan, and we're not hearing more about some of the big trade relationships with the UK that are worth multiples of billions of pounds and much more as well. Does this mean that the UK government is less interested in working on, for example, the Indian trade deal?
No, absolutely not. The India trade deal is a massive, it will be a massive event for the UK. And those negotiations are right now progressing. I think 17 out of 24 chapters are now closed. And we're now at the business end of that in the nitty gritty on that deal. And that will always be a huge deal, a bit like the CPTPP. Another big deal that we've done post Brexit. But we have to be strategic about this as well. And Central Asia is a critical geopolitical area, and there are growing economies there, and all the stands that we can mention. And it's really important that Britain has a role there as well. So I think we're taking a pretty holistic approach to this, and not just being driven by the big numbers.
Well, on the India deal, I mean, it is one of significant interest. One of the key questions that's been coming up is around whether or not the UK will relax visa rules for Indian professionals coming to the UK. What's the latest that you can tell us about those negotiations?
Well, I think that's the point, which is that we're now at the business end of this deal. There's certain key things that we want from India, and there's certain key things that they want from us. And I can tell you that our negotiators are hard at work on that, and that will be key to getting this deal done. It's not for me to second guess at this point how that's going to play out, but the good news is that we're having these discussions.
It's been a couple of months now since we had the so-called Atlantic Declaration when the Prime Minister went to Washington. One of the key issues there was to do with critical minerals. That's also something that has relevance to where you are now. What's been the progress on facilitating that trade in critical minerals with the United States?
Well, that is, as you say, only in the last couple of months. These are big conversations happening at a geopolitical level between the two governments. I don't think there's an immediate update for you within 2 months of that declaration, but again, that is a critical area that we're working on together. And you know, the relationship with the US is an interesting one, because we're now talking at individual state level with a number of the US states and signing MOUs. So there's a lot of conversations going on with the US at both federal and state level.
I appreciate you saying your department is taking a holistic approach to trade relations, but you do nonetheless have limited resources. How much of your resources are directed to the likes of Uzbekistan versus deals that are much bigger or markets that are much larger?
No, I think if you look at the department as a whole, rather than necessarily where I happen to be this week, if you look at the effort of the department as a whole, it's absolutely commensurate with the big transactions. No question about it. The whole ratification now and the follow through, the utilization on the CPTPP is a massive part of the DBT agenda. And India and the individual, as I say, the individual state discussions with the USA. So I think as a department overall, you would see that there's a lot of effort going into those. These are the big wins. But but within that, we have a wider role to play. And Central Asia is an area that we haven't had historical links with very much. This is opening up very much in this critical geopolitical area. And so it's worth my while, I think, coming here for 3 days to find out what this amazing, young, vibrant country looks like, and making sure that Britain gets a part of the growth.
Who is Britain competing with for this trade?
Well, obviously the two. I mean, the geography of the Central Asian countries is obviously difficult. As once you could say, they're surrounded by a bear on one side and a dragon on the other, and both Russia and China are difficult neighbours for the Central Asian states to navigate. But within this, we have obviously the Americans are in the region now, the French and the Germans are in the region. And so basically the Europeans and what you might call the G7 states have got an interest in ensuring that trade grows in a fair way in this region.
There are still going to be people looking at, focusing on these small markets for trade and wondering where the big trade deals are. Is the approach being taken by the government significantly robust to tackling the large trade deals and building up the trade relationships in places that are of greater benefit to the UK economy?
Well, the first biggest and best trade deal we did at Brexit was a free trade agreement with Europe. 50% of our exports, 50% of our total trade actually is still with the EU. And yes, there has been some areas of friction around manufactured goods, but there's been great growth in services. But now we've got an opportunity to go to a much wider playing field. And I think if you take into account not just the Australia and New Zealand deals, but if you take into account the CTPP, the CPTPP, and the Indian deal, and what we can do across the world, we have got great opportunities for the UK in trade, terrific opportunities for the UK in trade. And, I think it's a very bright future for us.
Can the UK really compete, though, with China and Russia when it comes to trading with countries in Central Asia?
Yes, because at the end of the day, we have something that the rest of the world wants, which is expertise, knowledge, deep technology. Our universities are still the best in the world. Our technology is still the best in the world. Our design and innovation is still the best in the world. And we're a fair country to do business with. And some of the terms perhaps given in return for deals with China and Russia are perhaps not the fair terms that those recipient countries want to see. So we have a lot to offer them.
Well, that's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe and give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Wilcock and Jack Ryan, and our audio engineer was John Wasserman. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Lizzy Burden. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.